My brother and I, Robin and I, were Army brats. My dad was a career officer in the Army, and we lived all over the United States. My earliest recollections, my dad was stationed at Fort Snelling, and then we moved to Alaska in 1947, 46 and 47. So en route, my first grade education was spent in 4 different schools across the country, moving from Fort Snelling to Seattle, and then up to Alaska, where we lived for a couple of years. And then we moved down to Vancouver, Washington, right across the river from Portland, Oregon. And then we moved to Minneapolis for 6 months or so before moving to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we lived in Milwaukee for about 6 months, and then we moved to Colorado Springs. My dad was stationed at that time, it was Camp Carson, for 2.5 years until his retirement in 1953. And then we moved to New York City. I was 12 years old. All of that moving around, my parents chose not to live on the base. They chose to live in the communities and made many friends all across the country. And that's part of my education. I think that was, it gave me a much broader picture of what the United States is and who the people are and how we interact with one another. My parents were both very tolerant of all kinds of views, all people of any ethnic origin. My dad was, got part of his education from an elder Ojibwe man when he lived up in northern Minnesota. So we had a wonderful education learning about people from a very early age. When we moved to New York City, for a time I was 15, 16, 17 years old. Some of my friends were involved in Ban the Bomb interest group, much to the chagrin of my dad. At that time, he had a very highly classified, he had high security clearance writing for the government, and during the MacArthur era, had it become known that his eldest son was carousing with socialists and political activists, he could have lost his job in a minute. So I think that's the reason they sent me away to a boarding school. But anyway, outside of that kind of education, I spent the rest of my life, I enlisted in the Navy, coming from a military family and having uncles and grandparents who were in the military, going all the way back to the Civil War, well, to the Revolutionary War. People had been involved in the military in my family. And it was an honorable thing to do, to give one's service. And the philosophical aspect of it was not lost on me. So given that we lived all across the country, interacted with people from all different ethnicities, my parents were very tolerant of people. And that was part of my education. And it gave me a very broad perspective of what our country was and who I was, how I fit into the milieu of opinions and beliefs and so forth. And when I enlisted in the Navy, when Robin and I enlisted in 1964, we did so partly because it was a good time in our lives to do that. We were both having trouble in college. But it was an honorable thing to do. And I loved my country. I loved the principles that democracy stood for. And I grew up, as a child, I grew up every Monday morning pledging allegiance to the flag, and very proud to do so, and very proud of our heritage. And liberty and justice for all was something I believed that America stood for. The beacon on the hill that other countries tried to emulate, tried to, that this was where people wanted to come to live. So I enlisted in the Navy and spent 4 years. I spent 8 months in Vietnam with Naval Support Activities, Da Nang. Robin spent Robin spent a whole year with the 3rd Marine Division up around Hue. Robin was a corpsman. And I got out of the service in 1968, and I had worked in the paper mill up in International Falls just prior to enlisting. And I got my old job back, but I chose not to live in International Falls and work in the paper mill for the rest of my life, and I became a merchant seaman on the Great Lakes. And my interests at that time were taking care of my family. I got married in 1971, had a daughter in 1977. I was a typical I had a typical life of many Americans. I had problems in my marriage, and I got divorced. I got remarried, and that marriage didn't last either. But my interests were not political. They were very down to earth, trying to make sure I got my bills paid. Yeah, I lived a pretty typical middle-class American life, paying the bills, taking care of the family. I was fortunate to retire early. I retired in 1999, moved to Tucson. I met another wonderful lady who I married in 2006. She was Swedish, and I moved to Sweden. And that's where I live now. But in that course of time, I started reading Thom Hartmann. And Thom Hartmann was able to put into words that resonated with me about the fraud that corporations were perpetrating on our democracy. Hartman gave me a lot of background information I hadn't been aware of. I was aware that corporations were able to have a louder say, a greater say in legislation that was being passed for their own benefit. Early on, I thought, well, that's a good thing. That's business is good for America because business employs people. But it became a point of contention. There are a few instances that I saw along the way that were really unfair. Unfair for the small businessman who was trying to pay his bills. That the corporations were running them out of business and actually making them employees of the larger business. And so they weren't, it was much harder to be an autonomous businessman. Corporations made it very difficult for smaller businesses to exist. It was a process, a long process. Becoming more cynical about our government incrementally. The liberty and justice for all that was part of our Pledge of Allegiance. Of course, I came to know that liberty and justice was not for all early on during the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement had a big impact on me, and I became aware of the problems of not just Black Americans, but Native Americans too. And Native Americans weren't part of the Civil Rights Movement. Genocide, I came to learn and understand. The genocide of the Native American people has been taking place ever since the first Thanksgiving. And it continues to this day. But the Civil Rights Movement made me even more aware of that and aware of the problems of Black Americans, and that liberty and justice was for the select few, particularly those with money. So I came across Thom Hartmann on the internet and started reading. Thom Hartmann gave me a lot of the background information, particularly about the Santa Clara County Southern Pacific Railway Supreme Court case that set a precedent about corporate personhood. And the details of how that came about were intriguing in that it wasn't a decree of the court. The court in that case didn't address corporate personhood. But the clerk of the court, J.C. Bancroft Davis, had in a previous employ been the president of an East Coast railway. I don't know which one. But his conflict of interest in that case is blatantly apparent. And he wrote in the headnotes of the case. The headnotes is a description of what the case is about. And he wrote in the headnotes that for the sake of the 14th Amendment, corporations are legal persons entitled to equal protection under the law. Now that is what the Southern Pacific Railway had argued in support of their case. But as I said, the court did not address that. They did not address corporate personhood, though they found for the Southern Pacific Railway in the case. They won the case. But Davis's headnotes stood since 1886 as the precedent that corporations were legal persons. Now, Judge Waite read those headnotes. I'm sure that he was not unaware of what was in there. But he didn't redact them and let it stand. And so legal scholars and students and attorneys, prosecuting and defense attorneys have always known that that's the way it was. And that was supposedly a Supreme Court decision that we know didn't happen. So that got me pissed off. And I said, why don't people know about this? And the reason people don't know about it is because it's hidden particularly by the corporations and by those who get their entitlements from corporations, those who are elected because of corporate money. And it's not in the history books for the same reasons that nobody else really knows about it. How Thom Hartmann came across it, I have no clue. But it was an enlightening experience, and I did a little research on it myself, and read the decision. So anyway, my anger grew and grew and grew. My cynicism about our legislative process, and watching the legislation that was being passed for the FCC to deregulate all of the media, that voices were being silenced. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think there's lots of questions that haven't been answered about 9/11 that really needs another investigation. Where that might go, I don't have any predisposition about, but I think the questions need answering. That's all part of the anger that has been building. That our government is not transparent. That our government is, for a long time, has not been of by and for the people. Eisenhower, my dad was a Republican, lifelong Republican, and both my parents. But he was an Eisenhower Republican. And I guess I was too for a long time. I think Eisenhower was the second best Republican we've ever had as president, the first being Lincoln. But he warned us, Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. But that's just one facet of the corruption of our government. We have today the fossil fuel industrial complex. We have the prison industrial complex. We have the education industrial complex. All of these, and there are many more, hundreds more. All of these are problems in our democracy, our purported democracy. We don't live in a democracy, if we ever have. If we ever have really lived in a democracy, we don't any longer. So along came the Citizens United decision. Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission, which I didn't really take much note of, except that they had vilified Hillary Clinton with baseless allegations. I didn't see the film, but in my reading, I just said this is hilarious, that they could find this much garbage about Hillary. I'm not a Hillary supporter, but nonetheless, the case came up and it was an accounting case. It was about whether or not Citizens United should pay for this blatantly political ad out of this pot of money or that pot of money. And the Federal Elections Commission said that they paid for it out of the wrong pot. And it went to the Supreme Court. Now the Supreme Court said, we'd like to hear this case, but we want you to go back and litigate it on the basis of free speech. That didn't really register with me. I didn't understand what they were up to. A lot of people did, including Thom Hartmann and David Cobb, who said, the writing is on the wall here, folks. This is a terrible thing that the court has done. And they started organizing. They started getting up David Cobb along with a dozen other legal people and supportive organizations, Progressive Americans for Democracy, or Progressive Democratic Activists, or something like that. There were lots of them. There were probably 15 or 20 organizations that came together around Move to Amend. And David Cobb said, we need a constitutional amendment to abolish corporate personhood. And we need to set the court straight that money is not speech. Money became speech after the, I believe it was 1976 Supreme Court decision, Buckley versus Vallejo. So David Cobb was a leader in this movement. And they were all way ahead of the curve. I didn't understand what was happening until after the decision came down. I said, there's no way that they're gonna find for the Citizens United. They can't do that. And when the decision came down, I was really devastated. I said, we've lost every shred of democracy that we ever had left. That it's been taken, our Constitution has been sold to the highest bidder. And I was devastated. It literally put me on my knees, and I damn near came to tears when I told my wife about it. That I had served my country, that I had loved my country. For this, the highest court in the land had sold me out. So the Supreme Court said to litigate this case as a free speech case. And I didn't have a clue about what that meant. I only knew that somehow the thing hadn't been decided yet. There are other knowledgeable heads that understood exactly what had happened. And the court had become an active court, not judging the law, but creating law. And they started to organize. David Cobb, Thom Hartmann were among those people. They were way ahead of me. And when the decision came down, the court said that corporations were entitled, as guaranteed by the Constitution, to free speech. And that they could spend as much money, going back to the Buckley-Vallejo decision of corporation, or that money equated to speech. They could spend as much money in our political process as they wanted to. And I said, no way. I said, I was devastated. I'm still angry about it. Forgive me if I get emotional here. But I was sold out. I had served my country. I loved my country. And the democracy that the United States stood for was torn to shreds. We had become an oligarchy, to put it in nice terms, a plutocracy, another benign word. But in truth, we had become a fascist state. That's what Mussolini defined fascism, as a corporate-owned state. The court had taken it upon themselves to give corporations the power to intimidate, and bribe the people that were supposed to represent you and me. It literally put me on my knees. And I damn near came to tears when I was telling my wife about it. And I was saying, there's no way this can stand. People are going to be rioting here. They're going to be marching on Washington with torches and pitchforks and tar and feathers. But the whole thing disappeared in less than a week's time. It was no longer news. And I said, I've been silent for too long. I told my wife that when Robin and I enlisted in the United States Navy, that we had taken an oath. I swear to defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I said, my country's calling me back into service. That I cannot live with myself passing on this broken promise of our government, broken promise of democracy to my children and to my daughter and my grandchildren. Well, I have a couple of stepchildren, and I'm very proud of them. And I said, I got to get off my ass and do something. And I decided that I had to wake up the country. I had to wake people up to what was going on, that their democracy was a fraud, that we didn't live in a democracy, that it had been stolen from us by the Supreme Court. And I told my wife, I said, Nina, I've got to get off my ass and do something for my country. And I decided that I needed to wake up as many people as I could to the problem that was evolving. It could only get worse. And I said, I'm going to walk across the country. And to make a long story short, I involved Robin. Robin is an adventurer. He likes epic journeys. He's been on several. He took me down the Yukon River back in 2002, went along with 5 other guys. It was a wonderful trip. But so Robin enjoys epic journeys, and I hooked him into doing this. Not to say that he wasn't aware of the politics involved, but he wasn't really up to speed on what had happened. He said it was a bad deal. But the anger was not there. The anger came as he understood more and more about it. But anyway, in my cruising around the internet, I found Move to Amend. And I took a look at all of the organizations that were on the steering committee. And there was only one on there, only one of these 15, I think, organizations on the steering committee that had a phone number. But I called that phone number and I talked to Jeff Milchin of Reclaim Democracy. And I said, I'm wondering what you think about this idea of walking across the United States, and if there's any possibility that Move to Amend would like to be involved in that. And he thought it was a great idea. And that gave me a lot of encouragement that somebody else thought that this could be something. And he said, I'm going to get a hold of somebody that can help you. And I'll give you a call back. If you don't hear from me by Friday, get in touch with me. So I didn't hear from Jeff. And I tried calling him, and he was out of town or something. And so I that put out some of the fire in me, but I said I can do this on my own. I'm going to send emails to all of these different organizations on the steering committee for Move to Amend. And so I spammed them all. I said, this is what I'm planning on doing. If Move to Amend can help me, I'll be more than happy. It would be wonderful. But if you people don't pick up on this, I'm going to do it anyway. Well, I heard back from Mary Zepernick, who got a hold of David Cobb. And that it was a good thing to do. And then I got a hold of Jeff Milchin again, and he told me that David Cobb was the person to talk to. And I got an email from David Cobb, who said to give him a call. He had been busy. I've been trying for several weeks to get a hold of David Cobb, and finally Mary Zepernick and Jeff Milchin, and there may have been others, said, this old coot is going to do something in our name, and we ought to be on top of this. So I called David, and he started vetting me to make sure that I hadn't been arrested or hadn't spent time in a mental institution. And having been arrested wouldn't have been a bad mark, but for what might have made a difference. But I haven't been arrested ever. And I vetted David Cobb. I'd never heard of him before. Turns out he was the Green Party presidential candidate in 2004. So I'd never spoken with a presidential candidate one-on-one. And I thought, well, that's cool. And so we talked, and as it evolved, Move to Amend had no money, couldn't support us, but they could help us out logistically along the way. They could provide people to help us get media contacts, might find a place for us to bed down at night. But he said, y'all got to come out here to Eureka and spend some time learning how to talk with the media. And I said, yeah, baby, this is going to happen. We're going to do this. David Cobb, David Cobb gave us a wonderful education on how to meet with the media, how to shorten our 20-minute speech down to a 15-second soundbite, how to take charge of an interview and not talk about how many pairs of shoes we'd worn out, but to talk about the issues and to keep the interviewer on track. All of those things were wonderful education for us. And David Cobb put us up for 6 days and spent a lot of time teaching us how to talk with the media. So that's how I came to be so pissed off that I had to get off my ass and do something. I had never done anything in my life. I was a working man, middle class. I had retired, I had time, and I had the wherewithal to spend 6 months on the road on my own money. And I had to do it. It's something I had to do. I was driven by my anger to make a mark for my daughter, my children, and my grandchildren. So Robin and I walked across the country. We had, I don't know, 20 or 30 different rallies. Moved to Amend, got several good rallies for us. In Denver, there were over 100, 150 people. Kansas City, there were probably 80 or 90. Springfield, Illinois, Chicago, Madison, Wisconsin, Cincinnati, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, Chillicothe, Ohio, Athens, Ohio. Then on into West Virginia, we had a nice rally at Charleston, Petersboro. I can't remember a couple others. And then a big rally at the Lincoln Memorial on October 20th of 2010. We had left. We'd put our feet in the Pacific Ocean in San Francisco and walked across the Golden Gate Bridge onto Sacramento, where we picked up Highway 50, and we walked on Highway 50 the whole route. When we went to these other rallies that were off of Highway 50, we just put a mark on the map. That's where we left off, and we went up to these rallies. We had a nice rally that we arranged for ourselves down in Moab, Utah. Got a nice piece in the newspaper there. We got a nice piece in the newspaper. These are all small hometown newspapers. A nice piece in the Carson City newspaper. Nice piece to start us off was up in International Falls. The lady that wrote that article knew our family, knew my mom and dad, and she wrote about some of my family background, what had set me off. So we got to Washington. We walked across the Arlington Memorial Bridge with about 30 people in tow. We got to the Lincoln Memorial, where we were met by maybe a couple of hundred, including tourists that were there to read the immortal words of the Gettysburg Address on the Lincoln Memorial. And Bill Moyer, not the TV personality, but he was the founder of the Backbone Campaign, which is involved in all kinds of wonderful street theater. Bill Moyer had a scroll, some 200 feet long, of the preamble to the Constitution. And people were allowed to put their names on the preamble to the Constitution, on the 200 feet of canvas that dyed and painted up to look like a scroll. A wonderful piece of artwork. And people's signatures all over it, from all walks of life all across the country. People allowed to sign that. We gave speeches. David Cobb was there. He gave a speech. There was other political activists there that talked. We had a wonderful reception at the Busboys and Poets restaurant. There were, the room was filled with the giants of the political left, the political activists. It was, and lots of speech making. I read the names of all the people who had contributed monetarily and with places to stay overnight. I read the names, I don't know, there's 70 or 80 people that we met along the way that put us up for the night. And then the next 5 days, we finished our walk to the Atlantic Ocean. And at Ocean City, Maryland, we walked across the boardwalk and down across the beach and put our feet in the Atlantic to complete the walk across the United States. Along the way, we had countless moments that energized us, we'd talk to people and we'd see their eyes lighten up and they, yeah, that's, you know, you guys are, that's a wonderful thing you guys are doing. Thank you for doing what you're doing, and we understand the problem. We got to Grand Junction, Colorado, and we got a motel for the night. And I was talking with the owner, the guy at the desk who owned the motel. We slept cheap. We didn't. We tried to stay with the mom and pop motels. Tried to eat at the mom and pop restaurants along the way. But the guy at the desk, he and I had a conversation about what we were doing and what a good thing it was. But he said, you guys ought to go to the Tea Party picnic. It's taking place this weekend. We got there on a Friday night. It's taking place on Saturday. And I said, wow, this is fantastic. We got to talk to those people. So we did. We stayed overnight at the motel and actually stayed another night at the motel. But we went to the picnic. And that was an aha moment for me. Everyone that we talked to, all the people involved there that we talked to, and it was a mixed crowd. There were young and old people. They understood what we were doing and why, and they understood that corporations had way too much power in our government. and that a constitutional amendment was necessary. And frankly, I hadn't expected quite that kind of reception. We didn't talk to them about other issues. We talked to them about corporate personhood and about the power of corporations to bribe our representatives. They're on board with that. They know that we have to pass a constitutional amendment. They know why we have to pass a constitutional amendment. Not quite so for the people that are leading the Tea Party, but the people involved, the people that belong to the Tea Party on principle, because our democracy isn't working for them either. They know what the problem is, and they were backslapping us and telling us what a good job we're doing. That was one of the highlights. There were others. There was some downside. We met 3 people out of the hundreds, maybe thousands of people that we talked to along the way. 3 people. One of them owned the radio station that we just had an interview with. We met him in the parking lot outside. He was just coming in. I said, and he told us who he was, and we were just on our way out. He said, you know, you give a good interview? And I said, you didn't hear it? And he said, no, I was. And I told him what it was about. And he said, Robin asked him, do you want more power? Do you want corporations more involved in our political process? Or do you want them to have more power or less? He said, corporations can run our government way better than a bunch of legislators. And that was what he really thought. He was kind of a big burly guy, not overweight, but he was in good shape and reminded me of one of the Mussolini's brown shirts. Thought that corporations needed more power, needed to control the government because it would be done more efficiently. Another guy that disagreed with us worked for Walmart. He was a crew leader or something. He had a position of authority at the local Walmart. And he thought that if corporations lost their power, that Walmart would fold. Don't ask me why he thought that. But he thought Walmart was a really good organization. And the other guy owned a laundromat. And he thought that corporations were a good thing. Well, I told him that we thought corporations were a good thing too. And but if corporations lose their control of the government, then the taxes will go up. And that'd be a bad thing. His taxes would go up. He claimed that he made more than $250,000 a year. I have no way to dispute it, but looking at his attire and so forth in West Virginia, I thought he might have been, maybe he exaggerated a little bit. But out of all the people that we met, those were the only three that really didn't agree with us, didn't agree that corporations had too much power. There were so many wonderful moments along the way. It's hard to pick out anything in particular. The walk itself was a wonderful walk. We had great weather most of the way. It got a little warm in Kansas. But the physical act of walking gave me lots of time to think about how to put it into words people could understand. A constitutional amendment is absolutely vital to get corporate power out of our representation, out of our government. It may take more than one constitutional amendment. It may take 3 or 4 constitutional amendments to get the kind of democracy for the 21st century that we need. But it's going to take a constitutional amendment to abolish corporate personhood and to declare that money is not speech, because the Supreme Court cannot overrule a constitutional amendment. If it were less than that, if it were legislation to control corporate power, it could be litigated away by any other Supreme Court. So it has to be a constitutional amendment. We have to tell the court that there are limits on what they have said is true. In a democracy for the people, it is not true. Corporations cannot have power to own our government. I see my job now as part of a grassroots movement to get a constitutional amendment passed. Is to educate as many people as we can, and largely it's on a one-to-one basis. It's just talking to individuals that you meet and telling them what you're doing, telling them what they can do to help get their democracy back. Most of the people understand that they live in a democracy where they don't really have representation. I won't correct them. I won't put the words out there that would inflame them, inflammatory words like fascism, or even plutocracy or corporatocracy or whatever. But if they understand the problem, if they understand that corporations have too much power, it's my job to tell them what they can do to curtail that power, to take the power back, to get our representative back and to represent we the people. David Cobb thinks it's going to take 10 years. Maybe. I really think that's optimistic. but I'm an optimist, and I like what he says. And we're working on a daily basis to educate. And that's where we go from here. And it's a long road. It's a long, long road. There are about 250,000 people have signed on to the Move to Amend petition or membership website, whatever. 250,000 people. That's less than 1% of the population of the United States. So we've got a lot of talking to do, a lot of education to do, and I'm looking forward to it. I enjoy talking to people. And I try to steer the conversation anytime I get a chance to talk about the issue. I don't talk about other issues. I try to avoid talking about healthcare or the prison system, the prison industrial complex, the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. I try to stay away from those issues. But when I engage people from any political perspective, I talk with them about corporate personhood and why it's necessary, absolutely necessary, to tell the Supreme Court that corporations are not part of the Constitution, should not be included in the rights bestowed by the Constitution. I tell them when they get engaged, when they are understanding of what I'm doing, that they can do what I'm doing, I encourage them to spread the word and to go to the Move to Amend website. Move, one word, movetoamend.org. It's a huge website, and it's got all kinds of information about what people can do as individuals and as groups to engage other people, to become active. The Move to Amend organization is a splendid organization, and they're very supportive of what I'm doing and what other groups of people in hundreds of towns across the United States are doing. David Cobb is a great organizer, and he's done a wonderful job of going around the country talking to groups of people about what the issues are and how they can become involved. Move to Amend is growing. We've got a long way to go. We've been, Robin and I, after our Renaissance, have been active since 2010. And we're still at the beginning. And we may be at the beginning for another 4 or 5 years. And that's the way I'm approaching this, that it's a one-on-one conversation that will wake people up. And if you can extrapolate that exponentially, it really won't take very long. But the fact is that waking people up is only half of what has to be done. You have to energize them to act. You got to get them pissed off. You have to make people angry about the situation in order to get them to act. I'm happy to do that.